Does any decent society have the right to tell consenting adults what to do with their bodies? On the 30th of November 2022, Cabinet approved a draft statute to abolish criminal penalties for sex work. It's called the Criminal Law Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Bill. It seeks to scrap the crime of buying and selling adult sexual services. You, of course, as a member of the public have, as I said earlier, until the 31st of January to make your comments on the bill before the process of making it the law of the land. Well, former Constitutional Court judge, but also the inspecting judge at Correctional Services, Judge Edwin Cameron, joins us now on the line to help us unpack this issue. A pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you for your time this morning.
Always a pleasure to talk to 702 listeners. Thank you, Bongani.
Our conversation is prompted, of course, by the article you wrote for the Daily Maverick recently, in which you say penalties on adult sex work are a horrible hangover from a harsher, more ignorant, less public health conscious era.
That's right, Bongani. And of course, we South Africans have a terrible legacy of misusing the criminal law. We used it to lock up millions of black people for past offences, to lock up black and white who had sex together, to lock up gay men like me for the way they were. And the hangover is that we're still using it to persecute women who use sexual services to feed their children and to house their parents. And the minister has now introduced this draft statute to scrap that.
That's, of course, the so-called Immorality Act, right?
Precisely. That was a terrible statute of the apartheid government, and it hung over South Africa, this moralism. The other big issue, Bongani, which is important, the one is, what do? We don't prosecute people for lying or for cheating on their partners, even though we think those are wrong. Why do we prosecute women if we happen to think that the way they use their bodies is wrong? So there's that question of the use of the criminal law. The second issue is about women. Most sex workers are women. There are transgender and male sex workers, but the majority are women, catering to the straight male population. And we persecuted women for most of our history, from the Eve story in the monotheistic Bible. And the minister, when he introduced the bill, when he declared the bill was available for public comment, referred to our national objectives on gender-based violence, on gender equality, on protection of women. And rightly so.
Because, of course, they not only are victimized by the law, many sex workers say that criminalization of their work exposes them to all sorts of things, from being abused by clients, police officers who want to shake down or who abuse them, or indeed blackmail.
Exactly. Bongani, you put your finger on it. And, of course, because it's a crime, women have to operate in the shadows. And often, and sadly I say this, police officers take advantage of them, not only to shake them down for bribes, but often to rape them, to say, I'll let you go if you offer your sexual services to me. The minister rightly says that by taking away the crime, we will enable women to seek health services, to assert their rights better, to seek employment protection if they're working in a group situation. But one lawyer's point, which I think is important, Bongani, is that the bill only scraps the crimes. And thank goodness it is decades overdue. What will still be done, and the minister indicated this, is that we will regulate sex work. We regulate where you can sell newspapers or where a supermarket or a shopping mall can be. So it is reasonable for us to say, not in this part, not there, or even conceivably to offer voluntary health checks as part of regulation. All of those will be improvements.
All right, we'll talk about that a little later on, though. But here's a question. People might raise an objection and say, hang on, brothels are by very nature, at least currently, places of sexual exploitation. We know they're often notorious for things like human trafficking. Would legalizing their operations not cause just as much harm?
It's a good question you're asking, Bongani. And of course, there's been a moralist lobby pushback against the bill since November. There's been a lot of talk that we are going to increase sexual services, we're going to increase immorality. None of that has happened in countries where they've abolished the crime of sex work. So I think it's scaremongering. We are right to be concerned about the exploitation of women, whether or not they're sex workers. So we are right to be concerned that we shouldn't be exposing women to more exploitation and violence. But taking away the crime enables us to do better on other forms of protection. At least you're getting the criminal law right out of an area where it should never have been in the first place.
In your piece, you highlight New Zealand as a success where this has happened, where this kind of work has been decriminalized and they haven't seen rates increase as many, to use your word, moralists fear. But here's another question for you. We have seen in New Zealand cases where it's been documented that, in fact, human trafficking has thrived there because some of their regulations include things like police not being able to search an establishment unless a complaint has been laid. So in effect, these crimes remain hidden in plain sight.
Fair point, Bongani, and we've got to fine-tune our post-criminal law regulation to ensure that we safeguard people against human trafficking. We know that in our subcontinent, we know that internationally, human trafficking is a real issue. But part of the problem that we've dealt with in seeking to be rational about the use of the criminal law against sex workers is that we muddle up human trafficking and sex workers, and they are two separate problems. Often people who are trafficked are used for labor, often they are used for sexual services, but that doesn't mean that you have to target women who choose to gain their income and to feed themselves and their kids through sex work services.
What about the Nordic model, which criminalizing not the selling of sex, but the buying of it? Is that something to consider?
Very interesting, Bongani, and I'm glad you raised it. Let me share with your listeners that in Sweden, the sex worker cannot be prosecuted, but the person who uses what we call the John, the user of the sexual services, the male who says, I want a sex worker, he is still a criminal. It doesn't work, Bongani. It is overwhelming evidence since Sweden introduced that. It was a misguided attempt to raise the dignity of sex workers while still stopping the sale of sexual services. I go back a step as a gay man, Bongani. I was told by the apartheid government that I couldn't have sex in private with another consenting adult fully informed about me. Why? And why are we telling women what they can and can't do with their bodies? So behind the Nordic model, there's still this idea, you evil, disgusting women, you immoral women, we're going to teach you how you should be. That is wrong. Decriminalizing sex work scraps that whole outmoded approach to women, which the Nordic model, very unfortunately, still persists in.
What will happen to those who already have criminal records as a result of falling foul of the law as it stands when it is changed?
Well, Bongani, I didn't think of that, but it's a very opposite question. You know, in 1999, the first Mandela Constitutional Court scrapped the crimes against gay men like me. They abolished the crimes of sodomy and men having sex at a party, all the apartheid obsessions with gay men. But they're quite complicated. The court gave an order that said that all criminal process that is currently taking place has got to stop. But it didn't undo everything. That would take a separate amnesty approach. But I think that can be done. In England, for example, they have undone all the old offences that burdened gay men so much, being caught loitering or being caught whatever, soliciting, whatever the gay-related crimes were. And they've undone those convictions. And I think that we should lobby for those also with gay men like myself and for sex workers when this a sensible bill is passed.
As you said, there's been some pushback from faith-based institutions. One can imagine they won't like this very much.
I take the point, and our faith-based institutions are important to this debate. So I don't want to rubbish them, Bongani. I think we just have to say, what that we regard as immoral or harmful do we use the criminal law against? Now, our history in South Africa says we've got to be careful. But the apartheid government misused the criminal law, and partly, and I'm not going back to apartheid to blame our present criminal way, but part of the problem with our criminal justice system is that heritage of overuse of the criminal law system. And I want to ask the faith-based arguers, I want to ask you, do you criminalize your congregants who have sex outside their marriage? Do you criminalize your congregants who tell lies to each other? There are many immoral acts that the Bible, that most faith systems and ethical systems say are wrong. But we don't say bring in the criminal law. And that logic also applies with sex workers.
Right.
Perhaps it is wrong, but don't use the criminal law. It is a crude and brutal instrument.
Know the difference between a sin and a crime. Appreciate your time as always, Justice Edwin Cameron there. He's also the Inspecting Judge of Correctional Services. The bill has been published for comment, by the way, so members of the public are encouraged to participate in the development of the law. You can make inputs to improve the bill if you feel. You can do so at the Department of Justice's website. This is www.justice.gov.za. You can go to www.justice.gov.za.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions.
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.